Hello, I'm Alan Penn. I'm Professor of Architectural and Urban Computing at the Bartlett School of Architecture, University College London. I'm going to be talking about the way that design evolves and design practice evolves. In order to do this, I'm going to be discussing the early history of the British planning system, as well as some of the theories of planning, many of which have been associated with UCL over many years. I'm going to review my own research, which is in the field of space syntax, and I'm also going to discuss some of the implications of this research for China. In order to discuss this, I'm going to carry on to talk about the relationship between theory and practice, and in particular, what does this mean about the way that design practice evolves? I'm going to be talking about planning, which is in very interesting times at the moment. I'm going to be talking about the history, and the history starts in the UK in 1909 with the Housing Act. It was actually very shortly after that time that the Bartlett founded its first school of planning in 1914. Professor Peter Abercrombie was our professor and a major figure in the planning field in the 1930s and 40s. And he, in fact, established the Abercrombie plan for London. That's the first time that a major world city had a formal plan. The Town and Country Planning Acts came in 1947 following the Second World War. And this was the point at which we formalised planning as a part of the whole apparatus of the welfare state. By the 1960s, 1967, Milton Keynes was founded. And that was the last of the new towns to be constructed in the UK until just recently. We're just now going on to look at the establishment of potential new sustainable towns. In 2004, the local development frameworks were established. These include sustainability appraisal, strategic environmental assessment, and various other mechanisms. And then in 2010, the regional assemblies were abolished with the incoming Conservative Party. I'm going to read a quote here. In the longer term, the legal basis for regional strategies will be abolished through the localism bill that we are introducing in the current parliamentary session. New ways for local authorities to address strategic planning and the infrastructure issues are based on cooperation and will be introduced. This was the government statement at the time, and it has been followed through during this last government. Now, let's just take a step back. Ebenezer Howard is thought of as one of the great founding fathers of formal planning and urbanism. His idea about getting rid of the Victorian smoking slums of cities by formalised planning of new towns became an icon for all the early development of the planning profession. These new towns were established in a series north of London. London is down here, and Hatfield, Welwyn Garden City, Stevenage, Letchworth were the series of new towns that went up the A1, the major route to the north of England. The garden cities of Raymond Unwin became an iconic version of the way that landscape and the new utopian life of the welfare state was to be constructed. Professor Abercrombie, in the 1930s and 40s, of course, had constructed the same for the London Plan. Here is a famous image of the London Plan in which he identifies the local parts of London, some of which should be preserved, others should be renewed. And he put in place a plan for constructing London as a single major urban metropolis. More recently than this, the last of the major new towns that was constructed is the town of Milton Keynes, and was the design of Professor Llewellyn Davies. He worked during the 1960s and 70s in the construction of Milton Keynes, and today it is the most thriving of all the new towns in the UK. Amongst the others that have contributed to these discussions, Professor Sir Peter Cook is a great architect. He worked in the archigram movement of the 1960s and 70s, and his contribution from an architectural perspective is world famous in terms of ideas such as non-plan, the need, for example, to establish cities with new technology and megastructures as ways of constructing cities in the vertical dimension as well as the horizontal dimension. This will be very familiar to you from many of China's current developments. And, of course, his collaborator on non-plan was Professor Sir Peter Hall, who very sadly passed away in 2014. He is the real star of British planning and international planning, and over many decades has been a key contributor to many planning policies in the UK and around the world. He's worked, for example, on the definition of the Thames Gateway, of the various plans for further London airports and for high-speed rail, the Channel Tunnel, Crossrail in London and so forth. He's been the defining individual who has brought through all modern planning initiatives in the British Isles. More recently, Professor Sir Alan Wilson has been developing a series of large-scale urban models, and his contribution to this field is to do with the mathematics of urban systems and their geography. Professor Mike Batty is his colleague and is the doyen of large-scale urban modelling. And these are the main thrust of modern-day planning analysis tools, which are carrying us forwards in the way that we define new planning systems and new urban systems. Professor Bill Hillier is my colleague, and he has been working for many years around the area of space syntax. This is a field which is about the analysis of the spatial dimension of the city, the streets and squares that we pass through, the rooms in the houses, and the way that space and patterns of space allow individuals to come into contact with each other and to form a society. Now, what's the status of the theory with respect to architecture? Well, space syntax is based on a representation that is inherently social, and I'm going to explain just how that is. Here I've got a representation of two spaces. A room, let's say, which is almost quadrilateral, it's square, and an L-shaped room. And the dots in the room, the blue dots, represent people. You can see that in this one, every point can see every other point, and therefore every person can see every other person within the space. However, in this space, this individual is around the corner from the rest. Although this one in the corner here can see everybody, these two and this one can only see that one in the corner. It means that the way that space is shaped affects the potential social relations in the space. This is a very simple example, but it's one which allows us to become mathematical and to therefore quantify the relationships between people as they're modified by the structure of space in the environment. So, what space syntax does is it allows us to quantify configuration. It allows us to consider systems as all-to-all relationships between all parts and all other parts. But it also allows us to look at the relationship between one point in space, a part, and the whole of the rest of the system. Architecture and cities are inherently part-whole relationships. It's also important that what it allows us to do is to describe the statistical behaviour of people. So that's not just people as individuals, but the way individuals come together to act as whole groups, as whole populations. We can construct a statistical picture of the regularities of human behaviour. It turns out, of course, that it is patterns of space that seem to construct the relationships that are statistically regular between the way that people behave. So the main street carries larger through movement spaces than the back street. This is a statistical regularity, but it depends on the morphology of the structure of those spaces with respect to each other. What you have on the screen now is an image of the whole of the UK with its main road system. This major road system is something which has a structure, a morphology in just the same way as those two spaces I've just showed you, in that they are part-whole relationships. There are certain pieces of space in the system that are closer to all others and that are more accessible. You can see some of them actually around London here, the M25 motorway, in which there are some red, very accessible locations, others up here in Manchester, across the Northern Way towards Leeds. In these areas, the pattern of the road system gives rise to relatively shallow and integrated parts of the map of the UK. If we then look just at London within the M25 orbital motorway, we can see here that the centre of London, this road down through the centre, is Oxford Street. Now, for those of you who've been to London, Oxford Street is the main shopping street. It's in fact the main shopping street in Europe. It's the most popular shopping street in Europe. And it's the place that we all go to department stores and so forth. It turns out that it's also the shallowest place in London in mathematical terms. It's the easiest to get from Oxford Street to anywhere else in London, fewest changes of direction, and it carries the greatest flow of through movement in its local area and would, if it weren't for traffic regulations, be the main through route on the large-scale movement patterns in the city. If we drill into an area of North London and look in finer detail, and look in this scale at a radius of about 650 metres, that's a pedestrian walking radius, we highlight as areas of shallowness in our model a whole series of London's historic villages. London is supposedly a city of many villages, and here they are. Hampstead, Muswell Hill, Crouch End, Archway, Camden Town, Angel, Leighton or Stratford. These are all the villages of London. And the way that London has evolved over many years has been to create local pedestrian areas which are the focuses of retail, of local life and the local economy. Here we have two diagrams which are scattergrams that display the relationship between numbers of moving people in each space in a sample of spaces in the City of London with the degree of spatial integration or shallowness in the map of that space. And you can see there's a positive correlation. The shallower it is, the more people move through. And here we have the same, but for cars. And again, it's the same measure. The shallower the space is in the morphology of the city, the greater the flow of traffic passing through that space. It does turn out that where you tend to have larger flows of pedestrians, you also have larger flows of vehicles. These are the main streets. Where you have back streets, you have lower numbers of each and it becomes quieter. So what you see here is that same area of town, the Oxford Street area, and I'm going to show you, this is Oxford Street, this is Regent Street, this is Bond Street, Piccadilly Circus is here, Trafalgar Square is here, the River Thames is here. It turns out that this pattern is related not only to patterns of moving people and moving vehicles, but also to where the retail land uses are. So in red here are all the retail land uses, and as you can see, Oxford Street is a major retail focus. Other land uses fill in the interior behind this. So the residential areas in Mayfair, very high-class residential, as well as commercial office development. The other sorts of leisure activities, the theatres, the West End and so forth, all take advantage of this. But what drives the West End of London is the location of retail. It is the most valuable and it is the generator of people as well as of income. It turns out that many other factors in the way that cities function and have functioned over history are also predictable from patterns of space. In this case, I'm showing you the map of poverty and social class constructed by Dr. Charles Booth in the late 19th century. And this is a map of the East End of London in the late 19th century. The areas of relatively wealthy middle class red spaces from his surveys are on the main roads. The areas of black slum spaces are in the isolated areas in the back streets. These maps of social class and poverty and inequality in the 19th century city are very closely modelled today by similar maps of poverty and social deprivation. It turns out that space and where people live and where social deprivation exists is a constant in cities. And it's something we can therefore start to design and to plan out. The other series of issues that are often talked about with respect to space are to do with crime. It is perhaps related to social deprivation, but not necessarily. What this map shows are the little black dots are a crime against the person in one of our North London boroughs over a 1-year period. There's a very high number of crimes against the person in this part of North London. And you can see that many of them are taking place on what seem to be the red and more accessible locations. Well, that's not very surprising. If you're somebody who is aiming to pickpockets or to mug people, you need a supply of where the victims are going to be, and they tend to be in greater numbers on those more accessible spaces. However, what you can also see is that complete isolation doesn't necessarily protect you. There are spaces which are isolated where you still have people being mugged. This is not a simple mechanism, in other words, and the relationship between crime and space is something that needs to be very carefully unpacked in order to be understood. It turns out that having neighbours in your street protects you from being burgled, for instance. So if you're on a street that has very few neighbours, a small street segment with few neighbours, you're much more likely to be the victim of burglary than if you're on a street which is relatively long with large numbers of neighbours. Neighbours protect you. So, statistical regularities arise out of individual action. They must do. It must be the way that we individually make decisions about how to move around the city that leads to the observed flows of people passing through space that come out in my scattergrams against movement and spatial depth. Individuals make use of the individual affordances of the types of space that they work in or live in. For example, we make use of the fact that a street is a main street as a good place to locate our shop because we want to catch the passing trade. If I'm a shopper, I make use of the fact that a space has a lot of shops on it because it provides me the greatest number of comparisons and the greater competition between shop owners. So I probably get a better value product if I go shopping in an area of dense shopping aggregation. It's this that allows us to make comparisons between cases from different regions of the world. In Britain, people move in larger numbers through Oxford Street. In China, you have very similar spaces, which are the main retail streets in Beijing or in Shanghai. It seems that the pattern of space and the way that individuals move are very regular across our two cultures. It seems also that the economy that drives the shop owner to locate is the same sort of economy. This is not something which I would say is culturally relative. This is something where the cultures are actually quite similar around the world, around economics and the flows of people through space. This allows us to go on to make diagnosis of design problems. We can understand why a shopping centre may be underperforming because of the way it's connected into the urban grid. We can define why it is that another one is very successful and attracts large numbers of people. And of course, what that allows us to do is to go on and test options during the design process. We can look at different designs for how a new shopping mall might connect into an urban piece of urban fabric, and by making calculations of the space syntax variables, make predictions of how people will use that space. It allows us to forecast the population behavior, how many people will pass through, how many may stop, how many will turn from being through movers to shoppers. It allows us in 2000 to look at Trafalgar Square, the main symbolic square in the centre of London, which used to look like this. It had a Grade 1 listed wall, heritage wall here. The National Gallery is above the area, and there was traffic that passed through the roadway at the top. What we worked on was to help take the designer's intuitions and to test them. So we observed how people were using space, and we found, for example, that very few people would use the stairs in the corner of the square and move across the square diagonally. In fact, most people tended to move around the edges of the square and avoided the centre of the square itself. The people who were in the centre of the square were the tourists. They'd gone out of their way to go to visit Trafalgar Square, but they were being kept away from Londoners. So the project evaluated various options, and in particular it evaluated an option for construction of a new staircase down the centre here. It made a prediction that there'd be a 45% increase in through movement flows through constructing the staircase in the centre here. And in fact, that's exactly what's happened. This has become a very successful part of central London. It's thronged with people, and it's now a completely different feel and nature of the square in the centre of the city. The way our predictions work is if we have a regression line, a correlation between two factors. These are the degrees of integration of various bridges in London, and this one here is the Hungerford Bridge, this is Waterloo and London Bridge. This one could be a new bridge, the Millennium Bridge, let's say. And we know how spatially accessible it will be. We can make a prediction as to how many people it will attract to flow across it. It turns out that the prediction was a good one. So when we constructed that bridge, quite aside from some of its structural properties, it was the very famous wobbly bridge in London, which moved side to side from it on its first day and had to be closed for 2 years. It is, however, a very successful pedestrian link between north and south of the river. And that was a predictable number and something where we could make the case that it would be so at the design stage. So, space creates economy and the society. This is really important. The pattern of space that we construct in our cities is the main medium we have for generating a new economy and for creating the communities and the connections and the communication that create society. It does that by the way that space brings people together. It allows them to communicate and to transact. Sustainability is about planning our heritage. It's about the heritage of the future. What we need to do to be a sustainable city and a sustainable nation is to allow our children to inherit the world in a better condition than we have inherited it from our parents. And this is something which is now in our gift we can plan for. In Beijing, for instance, you have a major city plan. The city of Beijing here, and it has a series of outlying cities in the Beijing region, which are all marked for growth and for economic and social growth in the Beijing larger area. But of course, Beijing has major historic, fantastic heritage. Right at the heart of the city is the Forbidden City, as you know. And this is an area which is preserved. It is an area which is a national and an international tourist and heritage site. But just to the north of that area is a part of the city in the Hutong district to the north of the Forbidden City. And I'm going to just take you on a particular location in that area here, which at the 500-meter pedestrian level in the Beijing city is a relatively warm space. It's relatively accessible. And it looks like this. You can see that it has all sorts of small-scale shops. It brings together local vendors of vegetables and rather nice spice buns, actually. They have all modes of transport come together in a controlled way. There are cars, bicycles, and pedestrians. It's a highly thriving and active area within the Hutong. And that is actually the local area of community in that part of North Beijing. Now, what does this mean at the larger scale? Well, if we look at Beijing and its analysis at the level of the whole province, this is a model due to Taoyang of the whole of the Beijing province. Each of these areas here are the outlying provincial cities of Beijing, and they are areas which are all destined for growth in the Beijing plan. But what you see is that the larger scale road network is what holds them all together. And so we have here a model which is not only able to explain how things happen at that local pedestrian scale, but can also begin to explain the regional evolution of the Beijing region. So architecture must innovate in creating new heritage. The asset that we pass on to our children and to future generations is something that has to be about creating spaces that work for people and work for communities. These are the places that will become the heritage of the future. And that is what we work on with Space Syntax, is to help deliver our places that work for today that will become the valuable heritage of tomorrow. Heritage is a scarce resource. It's one of the resources which dwindles in numbers. Every time a building falls down, we have an earthquake, and we lose heritage, you can't reinvent it. It's something which you can develop new well-working cities, but heritage is the prime scarce resource, and it will get more and more valuable as time goes on. So China must work very carefully to preserve the heritage it has, to make it relevant for today, to make it work still rather than just as a museum piece, but also to build for the future. So, I've talked about the theory of space syntax to explain how it is that, cities or architecture work. But it also allows us to develop theories of society and the individual's interaction with space in those societies. And it's this that's a question. Is this a help or a hindrance for architectural practice? Well, theories create predictive or explanatory models which can base our purposeful action on. And for syntax, these are based on representations and statistical models. But we must also look for mechanisms to explain what we're finding statistically. So when we can explain that the way that people move through space places them on the main street, we have to try and understand what it is that an individual perceives in the street that leads them to understanding that it's a main street or a back street. It's suggested that we each use these sorts of models to guide our own personal actions, our individual actions, and we predict what will happen if we do something. That's part of what we do as individuals. So syntax suggests that we retrieve descriptions of society from the spatial structure in the environment that surrounds us. So we can understand the nature of the society that must have gone to produce the imperial palace of Beijing as a particular form with a very strongly centralized form of government. This is quite different to some of the more organic cities that you have in China. But the models at the individual level are not simple. And I'm going to give you an example. Here is a three-dimensional view, a panorama view of a building. It happens to be a rather interesting shaped building, but what I'm going to do is to look at it in a different way. We can look at that same panoramic view like this. I've unwrapped it into a long oblong, but even this is difficult to understand until we look at it from this perspective. Now we're seeing it as we would with forward-facing vision, and we can begin to understand the nature of the space in which we're actually embedded. So we see the world in an ego-centered way. When we look out through our eyes in the fronts of our heads and we have a field of vision ahead of us, what we're seeing is something we're quite used to. If we try to unwrap that into what the camera might see as a panoramic image, it's a much less understandable object. The point here is that individuals have grown and have evolved into the shapes of their bodies. Humans have forward-facing eyes, quite different to certain other animals. And in that sense, we understand the world in one particular way. So people are embodied. They're embodied through the way that they've evolved, the shape of their limbs, the shape of their eyes, and the cognitive machinery that they make use of in understanding the world. And this informs a meaningful engagement that they have with their environment. So we can say similar things about the way that architectural practices and designers and architects have evolved their social structures. Architectural practices operate in a market. They seek to brand themselves and therefore to differentiate themselves from each other. Norman Foster will have a very particular view. Zaha Hadid will have a quite different view of what architecture is and what they profess to sell. They seek to differentiate their offer and to be different to the next person, so they offer the client a choice. This forms of differentiation, I would say, come in three types. They will have an ethic. There are certain architectures who pride themselves on ecological views of the world. Others are commercial architects. Others may think of themselves as humane or social, sustainable community architects, work closely with community processes in designing and so forth. They have aesthetic ways, designs and styles and the appearance of buildings that they differentiate themselves with. And they're very, very proud of these. They also have design processes which they pride themselves on as well, and they are very radically different. Norman Foster's work uses rigorous design review and engineering. Other forms of architectural practice may have much more artistic-based forms of practice and processes that they use. So ethics and processes are where scientific theory comes in. If you can predict social outcomes, then there's an ethical position that one is forced to take. If I know that I can design in such a way that certain people will benefit and others will not, then I have an ethical responsibility to look after the people who have public access to my buildings. If my buildings are purely works of art and have no functional relevance to the people who inhabit them, then perhaps I have the luxury of saying that it doesn't really matter. But I don't believe this. I can show through our research that the way we design affects the way that people will live their lives and how their economy and their society will work. This means that I have a moral responsibility and ethical position. And as an architect, a practicing architect, I have a duty to do things the right way for the general public and for future generations. From a process point of view, it means that I have a set of methods to apply, which I can embed in the process. I can do design reviews, I can do analysis, I can make predictions, and I can bring those predictions to my client and help my client to understand the client's ethical position with respect to society. And that's my duty as an architect. So there are others who partake in this whole social milieu of the architectural practice. There are the architectural critics, the journalists, the people who write about architecture. They're incredibly important. What they do is they look at the world of architectural practice and they categorize the types of typologies of design that they see emerging. It is them that have a responsibility to interpret into language what we see in the graphics and the forms of architecture as it is built. You may be aware of some of these books. They come out from time to time. Rainer Banham's Architecture of the Well-Tempered Environment, Charles Jenks' Postmodernist Architecture, Colin Rowe, The Mathematics of the Ideal Villa. These are critical architectural volumes that interpret the product of architectural design into language so that everybody, including architects themselves, can begin to understand what is happening. Now, let me try and give a little model for what might be happening in the evolution of architectural practice. Here is a starchitect. These are the star architects that we know and love. And there's a whole series of them. Now, if you are a star architect, then one of the things you want to do is differentiate from the other architects. You certainly don't want to copy them. So they go off in different directions. And they all head in different directions. Sometimes they'll come together, and two from different traditions appear to converge in the form and style of their architecture or the processes they use to create their architecture. But every star architect gathers around them a coterie of others who aspire to that form and that kind of architectural style or typology. And you can see what this does. It's very similar to a particular phenomenon that you'll find in the natural world amongst starlings. In English, we call this a murmuration. And a murmuration has in it the word murmur, which is the sound of many voices coming together just inaudibly. It's a rather nice term to describe the flock of starlings, which has a coherence made up of many different flights by different individual birds. But in just the same way, the way that cities are produced over many years and centuries is the product of many different individual architects or individual designers. And it is in that way that a murmuration is perhaps an apt description for the nature of the design process and the way it evolves. What I'd like to think is that what we can do by understanding more precisely the algorithms of space, the space syntax of the way that different parts come together to create urban wholes, that we're able to think creatively and to support creativity at the same time as supporting the future heritage of what we produce. And with that, I'd really like to conclude. Thank you. 谢谢。